The obsidian spire of the Ethelgard ascendancy did not merely float in the void. It dominated it, a lance of black matter speared through the heart of a dying nebula, drinking the radiated energies of a white dwarf star to power the Empire's vast, spanning bureaucracy. Inside the High Council chamber, the atmosphere was one of suffocating elegance, a silence so profound that the hum of the gravitational stabilizers felt like a shout against the senses. High Exarch Valen stood at the apex of the central dais, his elongated, crystalline fingers resting upon the smooth surface of the control interface, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the swirling, desperate light of the nebula outside. He was a creature of refined evolution, a being whose species had transcended the crude necessities of biological urgency eons ago, replacing the chaos of emotion with the cold precision of logic and the absolute certainty of their own superiority. The Ethelgard did not fight wars in the traditional sense. They corrected errors in the galactic equation, and for the last 3 cycles, the era known as humanity had been subjected to the most rigorous containment protocols the Ascendancy had ever devised. The chamber was filled with the other archministers, tall, slender figures draped in robes of woven light, their presence marking the consensus of 100 conquered systems, all waiting for Valen's final pronouncement on the Terran matter. The containment field is absolute. Valen's voice was a resonant vibration that bypassed the auditory canals and resonated directly within the cranial ridges of his audience, a telepathic projection of authority that allowed for no dissent. The Sol system has been encased in a null-metric barrier. Their primitive hyperdrives cannot pierce it. Their radio signals cannot escape it. We have placed them in a cosmic quarantine from which there is no return. They are a species of noise, of chaos and combustion, and we have granted the galaxy the gift of their silence. A ripple of approval moved through the council, a shifting of robes and a subtle brightening of bioluminescent skin patterns. They had feared the humans, briefly, when the first Terran exploration vessels had stumbled upon the outer rim colonies. The humans were unpredictable, expanding with a reckless velocity that defied the calculated growth charts of the Ascendancy. They colonized worlds that were deemed uninhabitable. They terraformed with violent machines that tore apart the crusts of planets. And they spoke with a terrifyingly loud passion that grated against the sensitive psyches of the Ethelgard. But the war, if it could be called that, had been short. The Ethelgard had not engaged the human fleets in open combat. They had simply manipulated the hyperspace lanes, collapsed the jump points, and sealed the humans in their home system behind a wall of distorted spacetime. It was a victory of intellect over brute force, the triumph of the gardener over the weed. Subminister Calith, however, did not share the High Exarch's absolute composure. Seated at the lower ring of the dais, Calith's attention was not on the grand speeches of victory, but on the stream of raw data flowing from the sensor buoys located on the periphery of the null-metric barrier. Calith was a listener, a caste of the Ethelgard bred specifically to monitor the deep frequencies of the cosmos for signs of instability, and what he was seeing on his console was an impossibility. The data was not showing the flatline of a suppressed civilization. It was showing a spike, a rhythmic anomaly that defied the laws of the barrier they had erected. He hesitated, his internal organs tightening with a biological reflex of fear that his species had supposedly evolved beyond. To interrupt the High Exarch during the proclamation of order was a heresy that could result in exile, yet the pattern on the screen was undeniable. It was a pulse. A slow, methodical thumping that seemed to originate from the other side of the impenetrable wall. Calith looked up, his eyes meeting the gaze of the Exarch, and for a moment, the silence of the room felt heavy, pregnant with a threat that no one else had yet perceived. High Exarch, Calith's telepathic voice was faint, trembling with the strain of projecting upwards against the weight of Valen's dominance. There is a variance in the barrier readings, a modulation. Valen paused, his head tilting slightly, a gesture of profound irritation. The celebration of order was being interrupted by a technician's concern. A variance? The null metric is self-correcting, Calith. Whatever fluctuations you perceive are merely the death throes of their physics attempting to comprehend their imprisonment. Ignore it. Calith looked back at the screen. The pulse was growing stronger. It was not random interference. It was structured. It had a tempo, thump, thump, thump. It was spaced perfectly with intervals of exactly 1 standard second. It was not the chaotic static of a dying civilization. It was the metronome of something vast. It is not a fluctuation, Exarch, Calith insisted, his fear overriding his social conditioning. It is a signal or a sound. It is resonating through the barrier itself. The council shifted uneasily. The idea that anything could resonate through a null-metric barrier was scientifically absurd. The barrier effectively deleted space between the inside and the outside. There was no medium for transmission. Yet as Calith spoke, a low vibration began to manifest in the physical structure of the obsidian spire. It was barely perceptible at first, a faint trembling in the floor plates, a slight ripple in the fluid tanks that lined the walls. But it was there. Thump, thump. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, and undeniably heavy. It felt less like a sound and more like a pressure wave hitting the hull of the station, a gravitational impact that shook the atoms of the spire. Valen descended from the dais, his robes trailing behind him like liquid mercury, his expression hardening. "Display the sensor feed," he commanded, his voice losing its polished veneer and taking on the sharp edge of command. The central holographic projector flickered to life, displaying the sector of space where the Sol system had been quarantined. The visual representation of the barrier was a sphere of absolute darkness, a void where starlight vanished. But on the surface of that sphere, ripples were forming. Great concentric rings of distortion were pulsing outward, expanding into the surrounding space like waves in a pond disturbed by a stone. And with each ripple came the sound, translated by the station's sensors into an auditory format that filled the chamber. Boom, boom, boom. It was a deep, bass-heavy percussion that rattled the teeth of the Ethel Guard. It was primal. It was the sound of a hammer striking an anvil the size of a planet. "What is that?" asked an archminister, her voice shrill with rising panic. "Are they representational impacts? Are they firing upon the barrier?" Valen stared at the screen, his mind racing to categorize the phenomenon. "No weapon possesses that magnitude," he whispered, more to himself than the council. "To shake the null metric requires energy equivalent to a stellar collapse. They are a Type 0.7 civilization. They burn dead plants and split atoms. This is impossible." But the rhythm continued, relentless and unyielding. It was not the chaotic barrage of a desperate attack. It was a march. It was a drumbeat. The spacing between the pulses was mathematically perfect, indicating not just power but control. The psychological effect on the Ethel Guard was immediate and devastating. They were a species of silence and telepathy. Loud, rhythmic noise was anathema to them, disrupting their mental cohesion. The boom-boom-boom began to interfere with their telepathic link, introducing a static of fear that spread from mind to mind like a virus. Calith watched the readings spike higher. "The distortion is expanding," he reported, his voice shouting over the growing din. "The gravitational waves are increasing in amplitude. High Exarch, the barrier is not containing them. The barrier is amplifying them. They are using the containment field as a drumhead." The realization hit Valen with the force of a physical blow. The humans were not trying to break the wall in a traditional sense. They were using the wall to transmit a message. They had turned their prison into an instrument. "Prepare the fleet," Valen ordered, though he knew the command was futile against a force that could manipulate gravity on such a scale. "Scramble the interceptors. If they breach the barrier, we must be ready to purge the exit vector." But even as the orders were relayed, the rhythm changed. The slow, methodical beat accelerated. Boom, 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 boom. It became a heartbeat, a double stroke of terrifying intensity. The obsidian spire began to groan under the stress, structural supports whining as the gravitational waves washed over the station. The nebula outside seemed to churn in sympathy, the gases swirling into new patterns dictated by the rhythm of the Terran signal. Then the silence broke, not the silence of the room, but the silence of the void. A voice cut through the sensor feed, overriding the Ethel Guard's encryption with contemptuous ease. It was not a telepathic projection, but a crude, analog audio transmission, broadcast on every frequency, in every modulation, powerful enough to be heard through the hull. The voice was deep, weary, yet calm. It sounded like grinding stones. "This is Admiral Vance of the Terran Union to the Ethel Guard High Council," the voice said, the human language translated instantly by the universal linguistic matrix. "We received your message. You told us to be quiet. You told us to stay in our cradle." The drumming grew louder, a crescendo that made tea. "He lights in the chamber flicker. We found that unacceptable, and since you seem to appreciate silence so much, we decided to make some noise. Prepare for arrival." The barrier shattered. It did not dissolve. It shattered like glass struck by a resonant frequency. The darkness of the void cracked open, revealing the burning light of the Sol system behind it, but the light was eclipsed by the shapes that emerged. They did not come through hyperspace windows. They folded space around them, stepping through the gaps in reality. The first ship to emerge was a monolith of gray steel, a vessel so large it possessed its own measurable gravity well. It was blocky, scarred, covered in antennas and weapon batteries, lacking any of the aesthetic grace of the Ethelgard ships. It was a brick thrown through a window, and it was not alone. Behind it came another and another, stepping out of the breach in perfect synchronization with the drumbeat. Thump, ship, thump, ship. A fleet of thousands, formation locked, engines burning with a blue-white intensity that outshone the nebula. The Ethelgard Council was frozen in horror. The scale of the human fleet was beyond their worst projections. These were not the exploration vessels they had cordoned off. These were warships of a tonnage that suggested the humans had spent the entire duration of their imprisonment doing nothing but building. They had strip-mined their asteroids, dismantled their moons, and forged a hammer to break the galaxy. Valen looked at the lead ship, the TNS Indomitable, and saw the weapons ports opening. But they did not fire plasma or lasers. They vented steam. They vented heat. The ships were cooling down from the exertion of the transit. "They are not attacking," Calith said, his voice quiet in the sudden stillness that followed the arrival. "Exarch, look at their energy signatures. Their weapons are cold. Their shields are passive. They did not come to fight." "Then why the display?" Valen hissed, his pride warring with his terror. "Why the acoustics? Why the terror?" As if in answer, a shuttle detached from the Indomitable. It was a small, ugly craft scorched by atmospheric entries, flying with a directness that lacked all subtlety. It bypassed the docking protocols, ignoring the traffic control signals of the spire, and latched onto the diplomatic airlock with a metallic clang that reverberated through the council chamber's floor. The humans were boarding. Valen straightened his robes, forcing his trembling hands to clasp behind his back. He would meet these barbarians with the dignity of his station. He would demand an explanation for this breach of the peace. He motioned for the guards, tall, robotic sentinels armed with arc lances, to stand ready but not to engage. The Ethelgard were diplomats first, executioners second, and right now, execution seemed like a poor strategy against a fleet that blotted out the stars. The heavy doors of the council chamber hissed open. The air that cycled in smelled of ozone and recycled oxygen, a sharp metallic scent that clashed with the perfumed atmosphere of the spire. A single figure walked in. He was not wearing power armor or carrying a weapon. He wore a simple dress uniform of dark blue, adorned with a few ribbons of color on the chest. He was older than Valen expected, his face lined with the stress of gravity and time, his hair gray and cropped short. He walked with a limp, using a simple cane made of polished wood, the tap-tap-tap of the cane against the floor echoing the rhythm of the war drums that had heralded his arrival. Admiral Vance stopped in the center of the room, looking up at the high dais where the alien lord stood. He did not bow. He did not flinch at the sight of the robotic guards. He simply looked at them, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You have disrupted the galactic concordance," Valen announced, his telepathic voice booming to fill the space, trying to reassert dominance. "You have broken the quarantine. You have brought weapons of war into a sanctuary of peace. Explain your actions, human, or face the judgment of the Ascendancy." Vance looked at Valen, then slowly looked around the room, taking in the terrified ministers, the shaking Calith, the grand architecture that hid the stagnation of their empire. He took a slow breath. "Sanctuary of peace," Vance repeated, his voice raspy, spoken aloud rather than projected, forcing the aliens to strain their auditory receptors. "Is that what you call it? We called it a cage, but we didn't break out because we were angry about the cage. We're used to cages. Gravity is a cage. Time is a cage. We break them eventually." Vance took a step forward, leaning heavily on his cane. "We broke out because we heard something you didn't, or maybe you did hear it and you were just too afraid to listen." He tapped a device on his wrist, and a holographic projection sprang to life in the center of the room. It wasn't a map of the Ethelgard tear, itery, or a battle plan. It was a star chart of the outer galactic arm, the region of space known as the Abyssal Drift, far beyond the borders of the Ascendancy. The chart showed stars disappearing, not dying, not exploding, but simply vanishing, winking out one by one in a path that was heading directly toward the Ascendancy's core worlds. "We call it the Hush," Vance said softly. "While you were busy building walls around us to keep the noise down, our listening posts in the Uit cloud picked up a silence that was actually scary. The real silence, the kind that eats civilizations." The council murmured. Valen stared at the map. He recognized the sector. It was a region the Ethelgard had ignored, deeming it resource poor. "An anomaly," Valen dismissed. "Stellar drift, dust clouds obscuring the light." Vance shook his head, a grim smile touching his lips. No, not dust ships, massive ones, world eaters. They don't use hyperspace. They move through normal space, sublight, consuming everything in their path. They don't communicate. They don't negotiate. They just feed. And they've been heading your way for 1,000 years. You didn't hear them because you were too busy listening to the sound of your own superiority. Vance tapped his cane again. The barrier you put around us, the null metric, it acted like a lens. It focused our sensors. We spent 3 years watching them eat the Cygnus sector. We calculated their trajectory. They'll be here in 6 months. They'll consume this nebula, then your spire, then your homeworlds. The silence in the chamber was different now. It was no longer the silence of elegance. It was the silence of prey realizing the predator is already in the room. Calith looked at the data Vance was presenting. It matched the fringe anomalies the science ministry had dismissed as sensor errors. The drums, Calith whispered. Why the drums? Vance turned to the subminister, his expression softening slightly. Because we needed to get your attention. We tried radio, you blocked it. We tried laser comms, you scattered them. We realized the only thing you couldn't ignore was a gravitational earthquake. The war drums weren't a threat, son. They were an alarm clock. We synchronized our FTL drives to create a gravitational wave strong enough to shake you awake. He looked back at Valen. We didn't come to conquer you. We have enough problems. We came because if we didn't, you'd be dead before you even knew you were at war. And we humans, we have this thing about letting neighbors die, even the ones who are assholes. The insult hung in the air, but Valen was too stunned to react to the breach of protocol. The sheer magnitude of the revelation was crushing his worldview. The humans, the noisy, chaotic, primitive humans, had not only out-engineered the Ethelguard's containment, but they had also detected a threat the Ascendancy's advanced sensors had missed. They had broken out not to destroy their jailers, but to save them. It was illogical. It was contrary to every survival algorithm the Ethelguard possessed. You wish to ally? Valen asked, his voice losing its telepathic resonance and becoming a weak vocal rasp. You wish to fight this? Hush, together. Ally is a strong word, Vance said, checking his wrist chrono. Let's call it a temporary alignment of interests. We have the fleet. We have the kinetic throw weight to crack the hulls of these world eaters, but we don't have the scanner precision you do. We don't have the processing speed to coordinate a defense across 100 systems simultaneously. You have the brains. We have the brawn, classic setup. Vance walked closer to the dais, his limp seemingly less pronounced now, his posture shifting from that of an ambassador to that of a field commander. But here's the deal, High Exarch. The barrier stays down. The quarantine is over. We are not your pets and we are not your weeds. We are the wall that stands between you and the dark. You can stand behind us or you can stand beside us. But if you try to stand in front of us again, we won't stop for a chat. Valen looked at the holographic map, watching the encroaching darkness of the hush. He looked at the fleet outside, the massive, ugly, beautiful ships of the Terran Union. He realized that the silence he had cherished was the silence of the grave, and the noise he had despised was the sound of life fighting to survive. He looked at his council. They were looking to him, their arrogance stripped away, leaving only the primal fear of extinction. Valen bowed his head. It was a small gesture, but for an exarch it was earth-shattering. The Ascendancy acknowledges the threat, Valen said, and we accept your proposal. The navigational data of the sector will be transferred to your flagship. Our sensor grid is at your disposal. Vance nodded, satisfied. Good, have your people talk to my comms officer. We have a lot of work to do. He turned to leave the tea. Tap-tap-tap of his cane resuming. At the door he paused and looked back. One more thing, Exarch, when the shooting starts, it's going to get loud. Try not to get a headache. With that, the human walked out, leaving the Ethelguard alone in their silent chamber, which suddenly felt very small and very fragile. The transition from Cold War to active alliance was not smooth. The cultures clashed instantly. The Ethelguard valued deliberation, weeks of council meetings to decide on the movement of a single frigate. The humans operated on a chaotic meritocracy of immediate action. When the Terran engineers boarded the Obsidian Spire to integrate the sensor grids, they brought with them noise, music, shouting, and a terrifying tendency to disassemble critical components without asking permission. Yet as Calith observed them, he saw the method in their madness. The humans were adaptable. Where the Ethelguard technology was rigid and specialized, human technology was modular and redundant. If a system failed, they didn't replace it. They bypassed it, hotwired it, or kicked it until it worked. It was crude, but it was resilient. And resilience was exactly what they would need against the hush. Weeks turned into months. The combined fleet gathered at the edge of the Cygnus sector, a strange armada of sleek, crystalline Ethelguard cruisers flanked by the brutalist blocks of Terran dreadnoughts. The tension was palpable. The Ethelgard crews were telepathically anxious, a constant hum of worry that the humans had to learn to ignore. The human crews were boisterous, running drills that involved firing live ordnance at debris fields, filling the void with flashes of light and radiation. Vance remained the linchpin, coordinating with Valen. Their relationship was icy, defined by necessity, but a grudging respect began to form. Valen saw that Vance's calmness was not a lack of emotion, but a mastery of it. Vance saw that Valen's arrogance was a shield for a deep, crushing responsibility to protect his people. Then the hush arrived. It didn't appear on sensors as ships. It appeared as an absence. The star field simply began to vanish. The enemy vessels were vantablack spheres absorbing all light radar and lidar. They were invisible against the void, detectable only by the stars they blocked. They were the size of moons, and there were hundreds of them. The war drum's strategy became literal. The Terran fleet couldn't lock onto the enemy with optics, so they used gravity. The Terran capital ships synchronized their drives again, sending out pulses of gravitational waves. When these waves hit the invisible spheres, they refracted, painting the enemy in a map of distorted spacetime. "Target the distortions!" Vance's voice roared over the comms, breaking the stunned silence of the Ethelgard bridge crew. "Fire on the echoes!" The battle was a cacophony of light and destruction. The Ethelgard beam weapons, precise and elegant, sliced into the darkness, burning lines of fire across the invisible hulls of the Hush ships. The Terran railguns, throwing slugs of tungsten at a fraction of light speed, slammed into the enemy with kinetic force that shattered their armor plates. The silence of the void was filled with the scream of electronic warfare, the static of jamming, and the desperate orders of captains. The Hush fought back with gravity beams, tearing ships apart, crushing hulls like tin cans. The TNS Indomitable took a hit to its port flank, venting atmosphere and crew into the dark, but it didn't stop firing. Calith, stationed on the bridge of the spire which was serving as the rear command post, watched the battle unfold with a mixture of horror and awe. He saw a Terran cruiser, its engines dead, ram itself into a Hush sphere, detonating its reactor to take the enemy with it. He felt the telepathic death screams of Ethelgard pilots as their delicate ships were swatted aside. It was chaos. It was the noise the Ethelgard had always feared. But in that noise, Calith found a rhythm. The humans weren't fighting randomly. They were fighting with a savage coordination. They were protecting the Ethelgard ships, placing their heavy hulls between the fragile crystalline cruisers and the enemy fire. They were taking the hits. They were dying so the Ethelgard could shoot. "They are sacrificing themselves," Calith whispered to Valen. "Why, we imprisoned them. We treated them as vermin." Valen was watching the tactical display, his multifaceted eyes unblinking. He saw a squadron of human fighters dive into the maw of a Hush dreadnought to deliver a nuclear payload, knowing they would not return. "Because," Valen said, his voice thick with a new emotion, "they do not fight for territory. They fight for life, all life. They are the guardians we pretended to be." The turning point came when the Hush flagship, a monstrosity the size of a planetoid, began to charge a weapon that targeted the star of the system, Ray defending. If it fired, the star would go supernova, wiping out the entire combined fleet. The Ethelgard computers calculated a 0% chance of interception. Logic dictated retreat. Valen was about to order the withdrawal to save what ships they could when Vance's voice cut through. "Hold position," the human admiral said. "We're going to plug the barrel." "Admiral," Valen shouted, breaking all protocol. "That is suicide. You cannot stop a stellar destabilizer." "Watch me," Vance replied. The Indomitable, burning and broken, diverted all power to its forward shields and its main drive. It broke formation, accelerating toward the Hush flagship. It wasn't firing weapons. It was becoming the bullet. The war drums beat one last time, a frantic, rapid tempo as the human fleet poured fire into the path of their flagship, clearing the way. The Indomitable slammed into the firing port of the Hush World Eater just as the weapon discharged. The resulting explosion was blinding. The energy that was meant to kill a star was bottled up inside the enemy ship. The Hush flagship bloated, cracked, and then dissolved into a cloud of superheated plasma. The shockwaves scattered the remaining Hush vessels, breaking their formation, leaving them vulnerable to the Ethelgard's precision lasers. Silence returned to the system, but it was different now. It was the silence of the aftermath. The Hush fleet was broken, retreating back into the dark. The cost had been terrible. The debris of hundreds of Terran and Ethelgard ships floated in the void. The Indomitable was gone. Valen stood on the bridge of the spire, looking at the empty space where the human flagship had been. He felt a hollowness in his chest, a sensation he realized was grief. He turned to the comms officer. Open a channel to the Terran fleet, to whoever is in command. A new face appeared on the screen. A young woman, face soot-stained, eyes red, Captain Holloway of the TNS Vengeance. This is Vengeance Actual, she said, her voice shaking but firm. We read the flagship is lost. Admiral Vance is gone. Valen straightened. He clasped his hands not behind his back but in front of him in the human gesture of respect he had seen Vance use. Captain, Valen said, his voice projected to every ship in the fleet, Ethelgard and human alike. The sacrifice of the Admiral will be recorded in the eternal archives. The debt the Ascendancy owes to the Terran Union is incalculable. You have saved us. Holloway wiped her face. He didn't do it for the debt, Exarch. He did it because it was the right thing to do. What are your orders? Valen looked at the devastation, then at the stars. The hush were gone for now, but they would return. The galaxy was not a garden to be pruned. It was a fortress to be defended. And the walls of that fortress were made of different stones, some polished crystal, some rough-hewn granite. Orders? Valen asked. We do not give orders to equals, Captain. We request assistance. The repairs will be extensive, and we must prepare. The silence has been broken, and I believe I have developed a fondness for the drums. Months later, the obsidian spire had changed. It was no longer a silent temple. It was a hub of activity. Human engineers worked alongside Ethelgard scientists. The null-metric barrier around Sol was gone, replaced by a hyperlane gate that connected Earth directly to the Ascendancy's capital. The two species remained vastly different. The Ethelgard were still quiet, logical, and aloof. The humans were still loud, emotional, and chaotic. But in the council chamber, there was a new addition. At the center of the room, where the holographic map of the galaxy swirled, stood a simple wooden cane, encased in a field of stasis. It was a reminder that silence was not safety. A reminder that when the darkness comes to eat the stars, it is not the polite diplomats who save the world. It is the ones who make the noise. It is the ones who beat the drums of war so loud that even the void has to listen. Calith walked through the chamber, stopping by the cane. He placed his hand on the stasis field, feeling the faint hum of the generator. He looked up at Valen, who was watching from the dais. The new sensor grid is active, High Exarch, Calith reported. We are scanning the deep void, and we have integrated the Terran acoustic algorithms. Good, Valen said, his eyes turning to the vast window, looking out at the stars that were now shared by two civilizations. Let us listen, Calith, and if we hear the silence returning, we will be the ones to break it. Far out in the darkness, beyond the rim of the known galaxy, something ancient and hungry stirred, sensing that its prey was no longer sleeping. It sensed a new vibration in the web of gravity. A rhythm, a heartbeat, a warning. The galaxy was awake, and it was armed with the most dangerous weapon of all, unity. The enemy thought they had won, though. They could creep in under the cover of silence, but they had forgotten one simple truth of the universe. Nothing stays quiet forever, especially not when humanity is involved. And now the Ethelgard were tapping their feet to the beat. The war drums were sounding, and they played a song of defiance that would echo until the last star burned out.